Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar brought to you by the UCLA Nazarian Center for Israel Studies. I'm Dov Waxman, the director of the Nazarian Center and the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Professor of Israel Studies at UCLA. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Oz Frankel. He's an associate professor of history at the New School for Social Research in New York and the editor of Social Research and International Quarterly. His scholarship spans several fields, including comparative and transnational history, knowledge production and transmission, popular culture and its audiences, historiography and historical consciousness, and the history of the state. Professor Frankel has published works in American, British, and Israeli history. He's the author of States of Inquiry, Social Investigations, and Print Culture in 19th Century Britain and the United States, which was published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2006. His new book, titled Coca-Cola, Black Panthers and Phantom Jets, Israel in the American Orbit 1967 to 1973, was published by Stanford University Press earlier this year. There are numerous books, as I'm sure you all know, on the history of the US-Israel relationship, but they tend to focus on diplomatic history and on military history. This book, by contrast, takes a different and much more novel approach, exploring how American culture, politics, and technology have profoundly influenced Israeli society and shaped the American-Israeli relationship. I'm delighted that Dr. Frankel can join us, and I'll turn it over to him. He will speak for about 40 minutes. During his presentation, I want to encourage you to send us your questions using the Q&A box, and we'll have around 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. And now over to Dr. Frankel. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Waxman. Thank you for inviting me. I'll begin with a very general overview of my book project and then focus on one theme, which is the rise of modern Israeli consumerism. So in the wake of June 67 Six-Day War, as Israel and the United States were becoming more overt geopolitical allies, the meeting point between the two countries along social, political, and cultural axes grew exponentially with some unexpected results. The 1960s, slide 2, please, were the high point of American post-Second World War liberalism, with great society programs, civil rights legislation, the radicalism of the anti-war and new left movements, and the dawn of the conservative backlash. Beyond liberalism, a range of ideologies, progressive and illiberal, beckoned to Israelis, whether the feminism of member of Knesset Marsha Friedman or the extreme nationalism and racism of Rabbi Meir Kahane, leader of the Jewish Defense League. Both were American immigrants to Israel. In a different register, seemingly unbridled consumption, which was still rather modest from our vantage point, crossed the ocean together with its repudiation, as manifested by American models of consumer activism, Herbert Marcuse's critique, and the nascent environmental movement. A slew of techniques that sought to ameliorate the ills of modern society arrived as well. Self-actualization workshops, tea groups, Eastern religions, and Weight Watchers, among others. Youth culture, rock music, longer hair, sexual promiscuity, and drugs, albeit less prevalent than elsewhere in the West, were also a sign of the times. Consumer-inflected concepts such as quality of life, which was adopted as a mantra in Israel, organizations that sought to protect and beautify cityscapes, and popular human relations techniques were promoted as a basis for reform and renewal, aspiring to higher standards of public behavior and sociability alongside new expectations of personal comfort. By the late 1960s, such ideas found receptive audiences in a society that, beyond the cohesion born out of the perpetual state of war, was already stratified and fragmented, to a large extent post-ideological, and rather uncertain about its core values, especially after the dispiriting economic recession of 1966-67. Returning to the late 60s helped me to underscore the rather heterogeneous, often contradictory character of the American presence in Israel, something that links the turn of the 70s and more recent political turmoil. I'm thinking in particular about the conflict over the so-called judicial coup before October 7, when both sides received support and used language and ideas derived from opposing corners of the American political landscape. In general, the American impact on Israel over time has been much more variegated and ambiguous than is often understood. Consumerism is a major theme of the book. We'll return to it later. Consumption colonized the daily lives of Israelis, dispatching a bounty of appliances, grooming products, and other commodities to invade their homes. Coca-Cola, introduced only in 1968, came to symbolize the transition to consumer modernity. The book then turned from commodities to military hardware, namely phantom jets. Importing state-of-the-art military technology fed the growing Israeli confidence in the technological fix in military affairs. I think we saw some of it on October 7. It also ushered in the local iteration of the military-industrial complex. Slide 3. Another major theme is the impact of the American racial discourse on Israeli life. I argued that the surge of identity politics in the United States had a ripple effect on Israeli society, shaping both Mizrahi and Ashkenazi identities. The book examines the rise of the Israeli Black Panthers in 1971 and follows the rather complex process by which racial tensions in the United States and the ethnic fault line among Jews in Israel were rendered commensurable or comparable. In addition, I explored the increased popularity of Ashkenazi motifs, Hasidic music, and Yiddishkeit in late 1960s Israeli popular culture, following the enormous global success of the musical Fiddler on the Roof. Slide 4, please. The turn of the 70s witnessed the zenith of Aliyah from North America. Newcomers modeled new approaches to individual agency, either through social activism, voluntarism, or through the language of rights, representing both American liberalism, but also its 1960s crisis. I think Rabbi Kahana is a good example. Professor of communication Eliu Katz led the establishment of the Israeli television in 1968. Tal Brody, professional basketball. But there were also American immigrants of a different sort, such as Meir Lansky, the gangster, who fled to Israel in 1970, seeking Israeli citizenship based on the law of return. After 2 years, Lansky was kicked out, but his Israeli interlude inspired great public interest in the Jewish contribution to American organized crime. Also keep in mind that the country was then led by a prime minister who grew up in Milwaukee, Golda Meir. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Shimon Agranat, was an American-born and University of Chicago-trained jurist. The last third of the book visits Israeli culture, including the immense popularity of the musical genre in 60s Israel, and the role of American characters in Israeli literature, drama, and film. In short, the book covers a wide range of exchanges and encounters. My purpose was to explore the making of late 20th century Israeliness through the prism of the country's busy negotiation with the ostensible outside, namely ideas, artifacts, practices, and people that appeared under the sign America. The expanding contact zone between the two societies reordered Israeli culture and consciousness, affected the swelling ranks of the Israeli middle classes, but also contributed to the politicization of lower classes and the widening of the gap between Jews and Arabs. The orbit metaphor in the book's title does not cast Israel as an American satellite. Instead, it signifies emerging ties characterized by a sense of affinity and kinship, as well as by persisting distance, resistance, and mistranslations. These relations were critical to the interlocking process of nation building and world making in late 20th century Israel. American rendezvous and chance encounters refined both individual and collective self-perceptions, where the Israelis embraced American ideologies and habits, or conversely viewed themselves and their country in contradistinction to the American other. Rather than growing profoundly Americanized, I would argue, Israelis forged unique trajectories into the American sphere. Slide 5, please. Let me now turn to Israeli consumption and consumerism. In October 1969, a large ad in Dvar Shavua featured a long-haired girl, you can see it in the image, sitting confidently on the hood of a Dodge car, hands clasping a knee. Under the title, "My Dad Has a Dodge Coronet, Good Car from a Good Home," she says, "We are from the United States. 2 years ago, we made Aliyah. At the beginning it was a bit difficult, but now we are happy. We gave up many things to live in Israel, including a large house with a swimming pool. But one thing my dad was not willing to give up, his Dodge. Last week, we sold our old car and bought a new one. Dad says he will always be faithful to this car." The ad conjoins sacrifice and indulgence. A good consumer and a good Zionist, Dad was devoted to both his new homeland and his luxurious American vehicle. No split loyalty here. The making of a consumer society is a cardinal subplot of Israeli history in the 60s and early 70s, often hidden from view in the shadow of the geopolitical narrative arc, namely the June 67 war and the military and political events that followed in its aftermath. Even the current scholarly efforts to delineate the historical path Israel took toward capitalism focus mostly on top-down transformations that originated in the state and involved skirmishes among political parties, decision-makers, and economists. The emergence of a consumer society, this constitutive dimension of modern capitalism, as well as its participatory, ground-up characteristics, are often taken for granted. And so are the ideological webs pertaining to individuality, family, and nation, in which everyday routines and material objects are embedded. Slide 6, please. In early 66, with the country on the brink of a recession, the so-called mitun, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol reminded citizens that during the previous 5 years, the Israeli standard of living leaped to, quote unquote, an astonishing height by 35% on average. This phenomenon has no precedent elsewhere among nations, he declared. The June 67 war brought the recession to an abrupt end. An economic boom ensued. In 68 alone, the GDP grew by a staggering 12%, instigating an additional surge in consumption that included a rise in the acquisition of high-end goods, from foreign-made shoes to cars and amenity-rich luxury apartments. I don't want to overburden you with statistics, but in 1958, only a third of Israeli homes had electric refrigerators. In the 70s, 98% of Israeli families owned the appliance. The Central Bureau of Statistics stopped recording the numbers of the remaining ice boxes. And the welfare ministry was giving away refrigerators and washing machines to poor families to encourage women to join the workforce. One device that increased by a factor of 35 within 7 years was television sets. In 1965, only 2% households owned them. By 1972, 68%. Beyond the acquisition of goods and services, the period witnessed the consolidation of a consumerist cultural order. Targeting the public was a rather mature advertisement industry, in addition to specialized magazines that catered to women and the youth, and a burgeoning celebrity culture that was busy with teen idols and other revered figures, whether entertainers, politicians, or IDF generals. One manifestation of the interest in celebrities was the popularity of public shows dedicated to personal interviews. New shopping venues, as well as novel marketing strategies, induced a sense of unprecedented abundance. Politicians and commentators began to address Israel as an affluent society. In my book, I examined the elaboration of a consumerist everyday in Israel, the local version of what the French theoretician Henri Lefebvre termed the colonization of everyday life by the commodity form. Central to this culture was the emerging figure of the consumer in Israeli public life. Beyond mainstream society, groups as diverse as IDF soldiers or conversely Palestinians in the newly occupied territories were now considered under the rubric consumers. Nevertheless, the consumer was an ambiguous figure that inspired sharp public commentary, debates, and controversies. Consumerism was linked either positively or negatively with conceptions of citizenship. The coupling of a thriving consumerist culture on the one hand, and then intermittent state of war or an ongoing state of occupation on the other hand, became a permanent fixture of Jewish life in Israel ever since. While seemingly at odds with the ideological and aesthetic inclinations of the old socialist vanguard, consumerism was rather compatible with the figure of the citizen soldier that assumed center stage in post-67 Israel, and even more so with the norms of the new professional or managerial middle classes. Nevertheless, the regional conflict was always in the backdrop of the consumerist everyday. For instance, it was paramount in the story of Coca-Cola, whose introduction to Israel in 1968 was considered not a sign of an advanced consumer market, as much as a symbolic victory over the Arab boycott. Slide 7, please. Consumerism reordered space and time, invaded private lives, including leisure and youth culture, and required new types of knowledge and expertise. For instance, the television era exemplified a range of arcane information that was attached to new appliances. Newspapers' articles provided instructions about transmission technology, the art of installing huge antennas that could capture broadcasts from all over the Middle East, or the ideal position of bodies, distance and height required for optimal TV viewing. Television reconfigured the living room and reorganized the Israeli evening, emptied the streets, and offered a shared experience that was in its initial stage richly social. Slide 8. The practices, ethos, and sensibilities of modern consumption-centered mass society did not require recurrent recognition of the American provenance. Examples of modern consumerism also arrived from Europe. However, in the interwar period, Europe served as the staging ground for the elaboration of American empire as an emporium of goods and services. European societies adopted American marketing institutions, service norms, publicity techniques, measuring tools, and the promise of a, quote, decent standard of living that was adopted not just by liberal democracies, but also by communist and fascist regimes. Slide 9, please. Historians of modern capitalism ask how and when financial institutions reach deeply into the lives of ordinary people. Well, in 1960s Israel, Bank Ha'Poalim's Dan Chassan Thrifty Dan program became a giant organization with 250,000 children clients by 1967, almost 10% of the country's population. It ran a successful publishing outfit, summer events, and holiday festivities. Dan Chassan was a didactic effort to encourage children to save and become citizens in the financial world, but it also habituated them in the world of advertisements, sweepstakes, special discounts, and diverse commercial incentives and prizes. Slide 10. In general, the incredible proliferation of lotteries, raffles, promotional gifts, and award-granting newspaper quizzes linked one commodity to another in a chain that constituted the dream life of the consumerist everyday. Margarine and chocolate and other products obtained at the corner grocery store offered an entry point to a grander realm of luxurious commodities. The consumer did not know what she was actually buying: a soup, powder, or a pair of bicycles, a bottle of soft drink, as in this image, or a wristwatch, butter, or a free air ticket to Europe. One Israeli psychologist said at the time that the consumer buys luck rather than what she needs. In Dan Ben Amot's novel, Don't Give a Damn, the protagonist, Rafi Levine, a war paraplegic, offers a cynical take on the promotional gift culture. He quips, quote, Didn't you read the ad? If you collect a series of 1,000 war casualties, you get the Yediot War of Attrition album, plus an annual supply of tomato juice and a free tour of the Suez Canal. Satirizing the new commercial life became popular, the fodder of commercial culture itself, perhaps another indication for the capacity of capitalism to absorb or even profit from ostensible dissent. Slide 11. The invasion of home appliances and consumerism in general enhanced the boundaries protecting domestic space. While consumption is often linked to the process of individuation, it most clearly reconstituted the Israeli family. Incrementally but consistently, the family unit would be more securely protected from external encroachment by the telephone and the intercom, its food chilled and safeguarded in electric refrigerators, its space cooler and rendered dust-free by vacuum cleaners and air conditioners, and its members' bodies pampered with cosmetics and undergrooming products, less sweaty and more hygienic. Ad campaigns worked to regiment bodies and to sexualize women, but they also targeted men in a culture in which masculinity had been previously confirmed through either labor or warfare. The efforts to keep bodies and homes both highly gendered and unpolluted was supplemented by recurrent public anti-littering drives to clean streets and neighborhoods and improve cityscape. These were initiated by organizations such as the New Association for Beautiful Israel. Standards of private and public cleanliness established stronger hierarchies within and outside the Jewish population of Israel. Slide 12. One commodity that exemplified the capacity of modern technology and modern capitalism to reconfigure spatial and temporal relationship was frozen food. Under the slogan, "Fresher than fresh," the sealed bag of frozen vegetables produced by the Sunfrost Company, beginning in 1970, appeared to completely erase the distance between the field and the urban kitchen. Underscoring the technicity of its products, a Sunfrost newspaper ad celebrated, quote, "the innovative deep flash freeze that stops time and keeps the vegetable in the height of the freshness and flavor." Sunfrost imported the seeds from abroad. That was unprecedented and followed all the stages of the vegetable's growth. The firm's products allowed consumers to eat ostensibly fresh vegetables all days of the week and even out of season. Slide 13. A similar promise to stop time was made by Coca-Cola. In Israel, the company faced a new technical challenge. Bottles were too tall for the local refrigerators. When laid horizontally, they began to leak. Coca-Cola dispatched a team of engineers that designed a new screw-top cap. The company even coined a new term in Hebrew for the cap, shasgor. An ad for the 1 liter family size bottle prescribed turn and close and return the bottle to the refrigerator. The shasgor keeps the wonderful taste of Coca-Cola until the last sip, exactly like the first cup, unquote. The great advance in the Israeli standard of living was a source of pride. It evidenced the ostensible progress the country had made. Nevertheless, the rapid, often out of control increase in private consumption outpaced government intentions and prompted deep concerns. Government and the Israeli elites in general sought to police consumption and taste. Private expenditure was often blamed for the mid-60s mid-tune, the recession. The consumerist tidal wave in the wake of the June 67 war provoked additional worry. Officials and pundits warned against an impending economic disaster, or even worse, the disintegration of Israeli society. Professor Benjamin acts in a conservative voice, saw in the rush to require durable goods and luxury services a suicidal folly, akin to other antisocial trends, including wild strikes, carnage on the roads, an emulation of foreign, especially American culture, manifested in the surging use of drugs and in what he called Pantherism, referring, of course, to the Black Panthers. Ultimately, he blamed it all on the political left, on those who were calling for territorial concessions. In contrast, on the left, Aryeh Lova-Eliav linked the crude materialist trend with the right's appetite for maintaining Israel's hold on the occupied territories to the very last square centimeter. The result, he predicted, must be emptiness, cynicism, and turning away from the best Jewish and humanist values of Zionism. A perception took hold that along with the consumerist tilt and the influx of foreign money and cheap Palestinian labor, work ceased to be a cherished value. Israelis were now in pursuit of easy money. Labour Party politician Esther Harlitz said, once we sang songs for labor and craft, today they sing for Coca-Cola and washing machines. The efforts to curb consumption moved beyond words as government unleashed the wrath of fiscal measures, taxes, customs, mandatory bonds, devaluation, and even threats of another recession to restrain private expenditure. At the crucible of the Israeli consumerist age, the Israeli as consumer found himself caught in a crossfire. On the one hand, he was interpolated by a growingly sophisticated advertisement industry, promising convenience, satisfaction, and pleasure, including sexual pleasure. On the other hand, Israelis were subjected to multiple disciplining efforts that urged or even attempted to force them to alter the spending habits, whether in the name of good taste, moral values, or to accommodate urgent national needs, the always fragile balance of payments, and the ever-depleting foreign currency reserves. Conversely, consumption was defended in the name of achieving or maintaining normalcy. Even the Histadrut General Secretary, Yitzhak Ben Aaron, not a friend of modern capitalism, thundered, quote, pilots fight so we could live our full lives. This includes striking and going to discotheques and taking vacation abroad and making money. This is part of proper life. In 1971, following the advent of the Black Panthers, another lively debate erupted about the Israeli standard of living, this time focusing on inequality. Pundits vie to explain what compelled the average Israeli to shop, often invoking Thurston Veblen's famous notion of conspicuous consumption, or the emulation instinct as an engine of consumer behavior. Even Golda Meir complained publicly about the loss of individuality, the ambition to be like others, like one's neighbor, one's boss, the person deemed, quote unquote, a success. Criticism of foreign lowbrow cultural products from the pens of self-appointed cultural gatekeepers proliferated. In Ma'ariv, Uri Kesari cast aspersions at the celebration of cultural idols in what he called the silly hit parade and other venues, which he saw as a product of, quote, Israeli apes jumping on the Americans' mimicry tree. If angry condemnation cast the excessive consumer as a derelict or failed citizen, a parallel, ostensibly gentler, endeavor was underway to promote positive consumer behavior. New organizations, most notably the state-initiated Israeli Consumer Council, presented consumer-based models of participatory citizenship that promised to bolster norms of transparency, rationality, and courtesy in everyday market exchanges. Shulamit Aloni, who led the council at its birth, developed an expansive vision of consumerist consciousness raising, public education, and consumer-friendly legislation, which she wished to inculcate, quote-unquote, Western ethics in the provision of services and goods. Aloni conceived of the vigilant citizen who would insist on a right to receive well-tested products and proper services for a fair price as a civic educator and the most effective foot soldier for policing the marketplace. In one of its first campaigns, the council recruited hundreds of mostly female volunteers to combat the price gouging of milk bottles. Milk was still delivered daily to Israeli homes. A few years later, Histadrut also expanded its consumer protection division. In 1973, it declared for the first time in Israeli history a consumer strike, albeit with rather modest results. Slide 14, please. Encouraging Israelis to adopt the language of rights, consumer rights. This consumerism militated against the runaway consumption promoted by the marketplace. In this context, the United States was perceived not as a symbol of excessive consumption, but instead as a paradigm for a frugal, knowledge-laden, and rights-oriented modern consumerism. This was exemplified by President Kennedy's 1962 Consumer Bill of Rights, and by famous consumer advocates such as Ralph Nader. American education was presented in Israel as a model for how to teach children to be cautious and knowledgeable consumers. Slide 15. Another state initiative was a campaign to instruct new immigrants now living in development towns in how to maintain and cultivate their homes and immediate surroundings. The Better Housing Association, Aguda Letarbut HaDiyur, engaged in its early years in a civilizing mission, another effort at cultivating Western values or at colonizing the everyday. This was not a consumer association per se, but an important aspect of its task, especially early on, was to teach new Mizrahi immigrants how to occupy modern spaces, use household fixture, and as importantly, keep the immediate domestic and public environment clean. Consumer-oriented practices could be found in other rather unlikely places, for instance, the military. In a series of articles under the title The Soldier as a Consumer, that was in 1969, journalist Nahum Barnea described how the IDF began studying and responding to soldiers' culinary preferences. Logistics corps officers surveyed what food soldiers prefer by, among other means, peeping into the trash bins next to military kitchens to find out what items had been discarded and thrown away. Slide 16. This attentiveness to consumer choice, the consumerist feedback loop, constituted one of the most important American exports to Israel and elsewhere. The feedback loop also became a tool of management, governance, and electioneering. The 1965 elections saw the first employment of statistical research for political strategy. In years to come, survey outfits that gauged consumer taste for new juices and sausages also began measuring, sometimes together, political behavior. Polling expertise came from the United States. Then in 1973, Shlomo Lahat launched what became known and sometimes ridiculed as the first American-style political campaign in Israel, in which the personality of the candidate superseded party affiliation or ideological differences. The candidate became a product, but equally important, the citizen voter was reimagined as an autonomous consumer, unshackled by previous party, social, and ideological loyalties, free to make her own choices, always in search of new options. Candidates were now to be constantly in touch with voters, shaking hands, taking photos, or participating in meet and greet events, Chugei Bayit, that became incredibly popular at the time. A radically different way of enmeshing citizenship and consumption was proposed by Minister of Defense Moshe Dayan. In an effort to portray the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza in the most benevolent light and to justify the integration of the territories into the Israeli economy, he told the French weekly L'Express that Israel was treating the Palestinians as any other government in the war treats its own citizens. Quote, "We are willing to share with them our standard of living and treat them as equals." Dayan repeated this argument in other venues as well, time and again. The dubious citizenship that he offered the Palestinians conflated political equality with equal access to the marketplace of labor, goods, and services, which of course has never been achieved either. More than half a century later, this kind of citizenship is what the Israeli right is currently envisaging for the Palestinians in the West Bank, often peddled under the rubric of economic peace. Diane's formulation gives a different resonance to the phrase decolonization of the everyday, which was coined in France when it was receding from its empire inward into its European homeland or its citizens' private spheres, ostensibly substituting one form of colonization for another. As historian Christine Ross writes, the privatized arena of consumption, its circular, repetitious routines, and self-proclaimed timelessness counterbalance the rupture and violence of the wars in Algeria and Indochina. Israel was seemingly advancing in the opposite direction, becoming an occupying force and a regional superpower. Nevertheless, as in France, Israeli consumerism arguably had a buffering or a dampening effect. Let me conclude, and slide 17, please. In terms of the 70s, Israel, the United States appeared both as a paradigm of intense consumption and as a model of restrained and principled consumerism. As for the Israeli consumer or consumers, they were subjected to recurrent criticism as well as a repertoire of regimenting efforts in the hope that he or she would become self-governing, rational subjects. These disciplining and civilizing efforts at the best very partial results. Cutting a rather stubborn and resilient figure, the Israeli consumer also had to endure the erratic nature of the Israeli price system, the burden of fiscal measures, as well as subpar services. Resourcefulness and agency left unchained or even cultivated in the battlefield were as hard to control in the marketplace, where the invocation of the national interest seemed much less effective. There was admittedly little heroism in this type of resistance to government prescriptions, but nevertheless it participated in the larger historical process by which the state and the ruling Labour Party lost much of their grip on fundamental aspects of Israeli daily life. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that fascinating presentation. We have around 20 minutes, so I want to encourage our audience members to continue to send us some questions for Dr. Frankel. I want to begin with a maybe overly broad question, and I hope you'll forgive me if it's too broad. But it seems to me that the argument that you're presenting challenges or overturns somewhat the kind of conventional understanding view of Israel, of the Americanization process in Israel. And I'm thinking particularly of a book written by Uri Ram, the Israeli sociologist, back in 2008, titled The Globalization of Israel, Muck World in Tel Aviv, Jihad in Jerusalem, where he basically makes the case that the 1990s is the kind of period of time in which all of these changes, individualism, consumerism, Americanization, came in, and that had a profound impact upon Israel. And that seems to be the kind of conventional view that the 90s was this high point. Your argument, by contrast, kind of locates this much earlier, in a period in the late 1960s and early 70s, which I think is still regarded as a period of kind of when Israel was like an ideological, mobilized society. So I want to, ask you about that. Was this a very kind of deliberate choice to push back against that conventional historiography? And how do you think it changes by locating this process much earlier in Israel's history? How does it change the way in which we think about and understand Israel's history?
Right. So I'm very familiar with Uri's book, and I think it's terrific. It's brilliant. But I think by the 1990s, we thought neoliberalism. And neoliberalism was not the case in the 1960s. And also the general commitment of Israel to capitalism was not terribly clear. So on the one hand, there's an attempt to move towards market economy, but also the Histadrut becomes actually stronger at the end of the 60s and early 70s. It moved in different directions. Actually, consumerism was one of the early signs that Israel is becoming more like, I would say, a European country. That in the wake of the Marshall Plan became very much, all of those countries became very much enamored with American consumerism. So Israel and the United States are very different in the 1960s than they would become in the 1990s. And for me, the argument is there's a lot of talk about Americanization, not just in the context of Israeli history, but global history as well. But usually it's essentialized. America appears as a paradigm of kind of modern capitalism, and I want to say it needs to be historicized. I mean, I'm a historian, so that's my proclivity. We need to historicize, and we need to understand that it's a historically textured kind of a process that really never ends. And probably did not begin in the 60s. The United States was involved, American Jewry was involved with Zionism all the way back to the turn of the 20th century. Right, for me, there's something special about this case, unlike other cases of so-called Americanization, is that
it's going to be my next question.
Triangular relationship between the United States as a whole, American Jewry, and Israel. And this triangle becomes even more visible when I talk about how race and ethnicity became a force. American race and ethnicity became a force in Israeli public life in the late 1960s. So, and there's a lot of connectivity and even affection, but also ambivalence about both the United States and American Jewry in the late 1960s. I mean, there's a lot of talk about Schno and kind of hesitations about how Israel is dependent on foreign Jewish money. When that's why it's interesting for me to think about people like Meyer Lansky, the gangster. And there's a fear that if we allow Meyer Lansky to stay, hundreds of Jewish gangsters are going to move to Israel. And the same fear was about the Black Hebrews, the small faction that moved to Dimona in the south, beginning in 1969. If we allow them to stay, millions upon millions of Black people are going to move from the United States to Israel. And there was this kind of claustrophobic fear and a propensity for moral panic in Israel at the time. And also Israel is under siege and there's ongoing state of war. I mean, that obviously complicates the picture there. So I think that the Jewish thing is, coming closer to the United States make Israel more Jewish at the turn of the 70s.
So I want to actually, I'm going to jump in now with another question. I wanted to ask some questions from the audience, but you mentioned the Judaism and religion, and it's very interesting because if we think about this period, this is also a time of rising religiosity and kind of growing tradition or neo-traditionalism, if you will, in Israeli society, a shift, and which obviously was reflected in the rise of the Likud party. So it's interesting that you're locating this as a time both of kind of growing individualism and consumerism, and it's also the time of living. How did those two processes intersect or interact, as you see it?
I mentioned the Black Panthers. Obviously, that's the most titillating episode. But there's also a lot of Yiddishkeit that comes to Israel from New York in the 60s. I mean, the immense success of Fiddler on the Roof. And then the Shlomo Karlibach, the dancing rabbi. And also, Israelis are aware that Yiddish becomes bon ton in the American argot. So by the late 60s, we have a Hasidic music festival in Israel and Hasidic rock in Israel. And so the country is sort of washed with Yiddishkeit for a short moment. That's, of course, also the Panthers then see Yiddish as symptom of the Ashkenazi hegemony. I mean, it maps on those divisions within Israel. And then I think it's incorporating kind of a national culture that becomes rather mature when Menachem Begin becomes prime minister. So this is not the negation of the diaspora anymore, but we incorporate those traditions and also religiosity into mainstream Israeli culture. The first yeshiva for Balei Tshuva in Jerusalem is an American project. It's an American rabbi that comes to Jerusalem. There's no precedent for that anywhere in the world.
So that was what I was wondering, because I actually, this may shock some listeners, but I actually attended many eons ago one of those American-style yeshivas in Jerusalem. Was that then this kind of rise of religion, return to religion? Is that also then this expression in some sense of individualism, this kind of quest for authenticity, the desire, the idea that, an individual can return to religion, which was also, there was also a kind of religious revival underway in the United States?
So I think the argument so far was that the country became more religious because of the Six-Day War, the kind of messianism,
right,
that engulfed the Israelis and the Israeli psyche. But I would claim it began before that, in the early mid-60s, for all kinds of reasons, including some kind of negotiation with American culture. I think Jews came out of the proverbial closet in American popular culture in the mid-60s. And that actually had an impact on Israel. And also there's the 60s. 60s is also about religiosity, as you said. It's about self-searching. And Israel, some of it indeed, became part of some middle-class consumerist culture. Before in the holiday, it's good to go to the synagogue and so on and so forth. And also, don't forget that Israeli TV had some programs, religious programs, especially on Saturday night, that including Hasidic music. And there were many performances that took the cue from that moment, that connected the popular culture in the United States and in Israel around Judaism, around East European folklore, basically.
So we have a question which I think ties in with this from Makan Arakan, who asks how you assess the relationship between the decreasing Israeli fear of annihilation at the hands of Israel's Arab adversaries and the consolidation of the consumerist culture after the 1960s. Is there a connection, in other words, at all, between these two things? He wants to know, does the indulgence in this kind of current mass consumerism help in Israel with the forgetting or the easing of this fear or anxiety about extermination? How do these two, this fear and consumerism, intersect?
I think it's a schizophrenic frame of mind that I think has characterized Israel, at least until certainly. I mean, the last year is sui generis year, but until recently. I mean, the governor of the Bank of Israel in the late 60s said Israel is the only country in the world who is, during a war or state of war, also increased its standard of living. And so I think there's some kind of a balance between the everyday of the geopolitical struggle and the everyday of the consumerist life, and somehow they actually help create some kind of a formula that I think lessen the threat of annihilation. That would be my speculation. But this happens concurrently. I mean, I think the war of attrition, this ongoing war at the end of the 60s, was the crucible for this kind of dualism. State of war and heightened state of consumption.
I mean, that is one of the kind of paradoxes of Israeli life, right? This combination, and it tends, when we think of like consumerism and individualism, the general view of these trends is that they, erode or challenge militarism, they undermine patriotic nationalism, the culture of the individual being. What in Israel, though, there's somehow the two were forged: consumerism, individualism, and militarism and patriotic nationalism. Was that I want to know really, A, do you think this is a kind of specifically unique to the Israeli context? And if so, how was that? You mentioned it in your presentation that they were made compatible. But how, if you could say a little bit more about how these two seemingly contradictory dynamics actually worked together in the Israeli case.
A couple of things. First, consumerism, what I argue, consumerism is not just about individualism, it's also about the Israeli family. But also militarism is about the Israeli family. It's about our daughters and sons, or fathers or husbands. And what happens with consumerism, it protects the domestic sphere from the outside, right? I remember as a child in Israel, we didn't have phone back then. We visited relatives by just showing up, knocking on their door. You don't do that anymore, right? You need to phone, you need to text. And this is not, and also this kind of the body, the protecting the domestic sphere environment became very, very important. But again, coming back to the other question that you asked, I'm not familiar with comparable examples anywhere. I mean, you can say that the French also increased the standard of living while the country was in the midst of the Cold War. But the Cold War is not unlike the wars that Israel experienced at the turn of the 70s and ever since. So I think there's something here that is unique, and maybe actually it worked well for the country to normalize the abnormal that is the state of war. So and occupation, I would say.
Sorry to interrupt. We have a question from Anne, I hope I'm pronouncing your surname correctly, Sewall, who's asking about specifically the connection between Israeli military consumerism and the relationship with the US kind of military industrial complex. This is you mentioned the Phantom jets. And so what was this, this broader process that you've described, was this also apparent in the military to military relationship?
Absolutely. I actually claim that the IDF, and we think of the IDF as the quintessential Israeli institution, was a venue for Americanization of Israel. Because what happened is through those connections, new kind of an ethos was brought to the IDF and elsewhere. And we see it in different places in the culture, professionalism. So there's a lot of imitation of, particular aspects of organization, especially of the American industrial military complex. And then again, Israeli pilots see themselves as superior to American pilots. And when they go to study on the Phantom in George Air Base in California, I don't think this air base still exists, they actually became their instructors. They actually taught them how to do dogfight in the air. So again, there's kind of the Israeli chutzpah and the Israeli sort of sense of self, and even some arrogance compensated for growing dependency.
Yeah, I remember T-shirts being sold in markets, don't worry, America, we have your back. That was kind of that idea. So we just have a few minutes left, and I have to ask, this is again, and I apologize if this is a very, very broad question, but I'm wondering, how you see the impact of this process of Americanization on the Israeli left or right. In other words, a lot of we tend to kind of associate Americanization with the consumerism, individualism, identity politics. In other words, we locate it often as having an impact on the left. But in fact, you mentioned Meir Kahane. We can think about, the growing number of American Jewish settlers in the West Bank. You've obviously got Netanyahu, of course, who we haven't even mentioned. But so how do you see or assess the influence of these dynamics? Was it uniform kind of across Israeli politics, or do you think, and in fact, in some ways, the Israeli right has been more shaped by these trends than the left?
Well, it is a big question. I would say we see in the turn of the 70s the beginning of identity politics in Israel. It begins on the left. The Black Panthers are on the left, but ultimately it benefits Menachem Begin and shifts to the right through Shas and other political parties. But we also see what we now, witness in the Israeli left, the rise of ideas about sexuality, about gender, about what later we would know as post-colonialism. So it actually goes across the political spectrum. But for me, the most important thing is how we, electioneering became rather Americanized. I mean, the kind of the technology and the know-how of how to measure behavior, that became sort of adopted by everyone. And Shlomo Lahat was a celebrity, was a general that became a mayor and a big celebrity. But we actually see in recent years also political parties congealing around individuals rather than ideologies. And we can, again, that begins in the early 1970s. So I think the effect is deep and wide, but it's not a single effect. And I mean, the divides, the fault lines in Israeli society are indigenous. The language that they assume and some of the tactics and the strategies are sometimes important. And we need to think about the balance between those two dimensions of Israeli politics.
Yeah, it seems to me that as you say, the metaphor I often like to that I'd like to use, and this isn't original to me, is the way in which McDonald's, is adopted all around the world. But if you go into different McDonald's restaurants, they're variations. It's right. I think the term is glocalization, right? That there's both the adoption of, McDonald's, golden arches, etc., and the ideas that's kind of transmitted with that, but at the same time adapted and appropriated in different context, in different ways in different contexts.
My point is, I actually don't accept the term Americanization. I think it's a judgmental term and it points to a particular target. It's a teleological term. I think 50 years later or 70 years later, with all of the encounters and the effects and back and forth, Israel is a radically different society than American society. So, and of course after the 90s this process accelerated and yet the differences are immense and I think are ultimately permanent.
Absolutely. Well, I am. This was fascinating. Maybe your next book can look at the other way, the exchange, the adoption of Israeli ideas and culture into the United States, because there's that is, at least in our current period, developments that we're seeing, and at least culturally and certainly in the realm of technology as well.
Israel also tried to export some of those products, including Sunfrost. There was an attempt to sell Sunfrost in the States, but also Broadway was awash with Israeli productions in the late 60s, early 70s.
Well, hopefully, your next book can address the Israelization of the United States, perhaps. Thank you so much. This was really a fascinating presentation. I want to thank all of our audience members for joining us, and to remind you all that this will also be available on our website and YouTube channel. So if anybody missed it, please let them know that it will be available on our website and YouTube channel in the next couple of days. I want to thank Dr. Frankel for a fascinating presentation, and I want to encourage you all to go out and purchase his book, which is available from Stanford University Press. Thank you again. And finally, just to let you know that next month we will be having another book talk as a webinar. It will be Yaakov Yadgar, who is the Stanley Lewis Professor of Israel Studies at the University of Oxford, and he will be discussing his new book titled To Be a Jewish State, Zionism as the New Judaism. That will be taking place on Wednesday, November the 20th. You'll receive some emails about that, so hopefully I will see you then. And in the meantime, thank you and goodbye.